recording.
Okay.
Just for those of you who may miss sessions, I'm actually recording and posting them on my YouTube channel for this Ezekiel studies by request from a group in Malaysia. So it's accessible there. If you don't know my channel, I actually have three, but the main one is under my name. So, all right, let me get this going. Okay, last week we looked at the theophany of Ezekiel that led to his commissioning and his calling, and that is chapters 1 to 3. Today we will look at another block of materials from chapter 4 to chapter 7. And this is the block of material that is painful to read because the target is the people of Israel, more specifically the people of Judah. The whole of Israel was no longer in existence at this point. And Ezekiel himself was already in Babylon. He was one of those early deportations before the main capture of Jerusalem. And during that period, God gave him visions about what's going to happen with the siege in Jerusalem. And so these first few prophecies about the fate of Judah, Jerusalem, the temple, must have been very painful to him, and it's difficult for us to read as well, because some of the language God would use against his people is very, very strong. You get the sense as you read through the prophets of this period around the exile that there is this strong repulsion of God against the sins of his people. Now, this segment basically has 4 not very long chapters, but in chapter 4, it speaks about the sign of the coming siege, and we will see how Ezekiel was asked to give this sign. In Ezekiel 5, then he enumerates or he elaborates on this coming judgment. And this judgment is specific to the fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the exile proper. And then the fulfillment of that judgment in chapter 6, and then a dirge or a lamentation about the judgment. There are several of these dirges in Ezekiel because after every block of material and judgment scenes from God, he would do a lamentation. Now, in our introduction, we learned that unlike most prophets, most of Ezekiel is written in prose, but the dirges or the lamentations, like chapter 7 here, is basically a poetry. So we will look at these 4 chapters today. He was asked to do something quite incredible, that he would have been seen as some kind of an insane person doing this thing out in the open. God asked him to enact the siege of Jerusalem. Now, at the time of this prophecy, it had not happened yet. And so this message must have been sent back, if possible, to Jerusalem, or at least to prepare the ones who are already in Babylon mentally for what was about to happen. As you can see in this picture, God asked him to take a brick, draw a map of the city of Jerusalem, make a fence around that brick, and then putting a metal plate between himself and that brick, he was to lie 390 days on his left side and then switch to his right side for 40 days, giving for a total of 430 days of the siege and fall. Now, we do have a problem there, but we will deal with that a little bit later. Okay, so we don't know how exact the map of Jerusalem was, but it probably highlighted the temple, the palace, and some of the important buildings, and maybe the main walls. By this stage, Jerusalem was about 4 times the size of David's Jerusalem. In fact, the city of David is the lower part of Jerusalem. It forms only a small part, quite a ways from what is now known as the Temple Mount. Now, in building the temple, Solomon expanded the city to incorporate the mountain or the hill of Moriah, where the temple would be built. Now he had to build a wall around it. Now the wall symbolized the siege itself. He also had to put, I don't know, maybe stones or some objects to depict the encampment of the Babylonians. As you can see in the picture, the different stones all around. He also had to build siege machines and put them against the wall. Now, we don't see that in this particular painting. And of course, like I said, he had to put this metal sheet between himself and the siege, almost as if depicting that he was not in the siege, he was not a part of it, he will never be a part of it, so he is separated from it, and yet he's lying there. Can you imagine what the people must be thinking? What is he doing? Now, 390 days, you're talking about an entire year. Okay, so this is nearly a year and a half of lying around. There's a diagram. We don't know how big the diagram is. We know the approximate size of the Babylonian bricks, about the same size as the modern bricks. Okay, so maybe a fence just big enough for him to lie around it. And he had to do this simply because God said to do it, not because of his own interest, not because he was eccentric, but because God wanted him to enact the siege of Jerusalem. 390 days on his left side, 40 days on his right side. He also had to tie himself with ropes and to prepare enough food and water ration for the entire period is lying there. Now, how in the world did he do that? How much did he actually have? Or maybe the idea is for him to have little food and little water, that he could eat only a little at a time, depicting the almost famine conditions that the city would experience before the Babylonians broke in. And then he had to defile himself by covering himself with dung. You know, a similar kind of picture we see with the Joshua the high priest vision in Zechariah chapter 3. Now Ezekiel, he pushes back on this because he says, no, God asked him to use human dung to defile himself. He said, no, that is too much. I cannot defile myself that much. So God relents and says, okay, fine, you can use cow dung. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever bathed yourself or covered yourself with cow dung or any other kind of dung. And a whole year, no bath, no washing up, just lying there beside this enacted scene with minimal food and water available. The whole point of the enactment is to give the observers there, the other Jews who live, because this is around outside the city of Babylon, to tell them exactly what's going to happen at the siege. It would be nasty. In fact, we know from both Ezekiel's recording and other recordings that it led to a severe famine, that some people resorted to some kind of cannibalism before Babylonians were able to break into the city. And then we have a question to deal with, because he is given a period of 430 days. Now we know that the siege of Jerusalem did not last even 10 years, probably just 2 or 3 years. So why 430 days? And in the middle of these instructions, we have a verse that Adventists have misapplied so easily. God says every day that you lie there will be equal to 1 day in the siege and fall of Jerusalem. Now here's a mathematical dilemma. Which time period is he actually depicting? Because the siege of Jerusalem, even if you count from the moment he was taken to Babylon, which is 597 BC, to the actual fall of Jerusalem, which is 587, 586, that's only a 10-year period. And if you wanted to include here, as some people have, the exile period, that lasted for about 70 years, no more than 100 years. And so altogether, in actual time, a day for a year, why was he asked to lie there for 430 years instead of the actual 110 years, or maybe less, or even less than 100 years of the actual events? So this is a major headache in the prophecy. And it's amazing how we have taken verses 6 and 7 totally out of context and applied them to Daniel's time prophecies, as if somehow Ezekiel was giving us a formula for how to interpret Daniel. Personally, I think it doesn't work for two reasons. Because the vision of Ezekiel is not eschatological, it is retroactive. It is looking backwards at what is happening or what may have just started to happen when he did this. Definitely nothing but future. Secondly, it's the time period. The math just does not add up, because he was told this is specifically to enact the siege and fall of Jerusalem, but told to lie there for 430 days. And that doesn't add up with the maths of that period. The only period in the Bible that has 430 is actually the period of Abraham, from Abraham to the Exodus. Okay, so we've got some anomalies here, what is happening in the Ezekiel, and I don't think we can ever fully resolve this anomaly. Nevertheless, the enactment for him must have been painful. I don't know how many of you have ever slept for an entire year or more on just one side of your body. You know, from a medical point of view, he was not allowed to get up, sit up, or whatever. Just to reach out for some food and water every so often, maybe a little bit every day. And the whole point is to show the suffering of the people during the siege and the capture of Jerusalem. Now, we have been watching another so-called siege and war in Gaza, and it's only 6 weeks old. Now, when the Romans tried to take Jerusalem, it took them about 3 years to fully capture the city and destroy. The Babylonians also took about the same amount of time. Now, historians say that Nebuchadnezzar actually invaded Judah and attacked Jerusalem 3 times, in 605 or 606, when he first became emperor, after having lost the battle or having defeated the Egyptian Pharaoh, Pharaoh Necho, at the Battle of Carchemish. He directed his attention briefly at Jerusalem, because Jerusalem had an alliance with Egypt at that point. The second time is 597. That's when he took many people, Ezekiel included, to exile. The third and final time is 587-86, when he actually burned the city to the ground, destroyed the temple, and deported most of the people to Babylon. So all of this happened rather rapidly, maybe not in a few weeks like the current war, or a few months, but just a few years. Definitely not 430 years as the symbolism is put here. I am one of those who believe that we have to be really careful in dealing with some of the symbols that appear in Ezekiel, because of the peculiar nature of the book and the peculiar things that God asked him to do. And this is definitely one of them. So there he was, lying for a long time, both sides, to enact the fall of Jerusalem. Now, if this happened in his first or second or third year in Babylon, then his own enactment would have been over before the actual siege of Jerusalem, which was around 587. But if he was asked to do this, and we're not told the timing, later in that period, then it would have coincided and served as almost like watching a film in Babylon of something that was happening in Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't really matter which way we want to read the text. What does matter is that God was telling these exiles, this is what is going to happen in Jerusalem. So don't expect to go back home right now. Even worse things are about to happen to your comrades and your families and your country people back in Jerusalem. And he tells us, here's just some of the conclusion that he had, that God told him, "Son of man, I will make food very scarce in Jerusalem." That's why the rationing of his own food. "It will be weighed out with great care and eaten fearfully. The water will be rationed out drop by drop, and the people will drink it with dismay." Think about the city basically running out of food and running out of water. Now, in the ancient world, running out of power was never an issue because they didn't have internet or mobile connections or stuff like that to worry about. But food and water, those are still common elements of any siege, even in today's world. You see, if you cannot overcome a city right away, you try and starve it to death. It took Nebuchadnezzar 13 years to overcome the city of Tyre because it was on an island off the coast. It took Alexander the Great 7 years to get a hold of Tyre. In the ancient world, siege warfare was one of the most common ways of going up against a fortress city like Jerusalem. Now, here's the peculiarity about the city of Jerusalem. It is the most conquered and rebuilt city in history. And yet it was quite a fortress. It took the Israelites over 300 years to actually capture Jerusalem, from the time Joshua brought them into the land until David captured the city. The Jebusites knew how to defend that city, and being set on hills, it was quite a fortress. But a city like Jerusalem, that's why it became such a symbol. And it's still a symbol even in today's world, in 3 of the great religions of the world. And it's not just the spiritual significance of the city, it's that the city really stood for something impregnable. Now, just as a matter of archaeological interest, Jerusalem has been conquered, flattened out, and rebuilt 34 times in history. No other city has ever had this experience. And we're talking about 34 times all the way to the modern period. From the time of David until our own 20th century. And if the current war expands some more, there may be another falling and rebuilding of Jerusalem, who knows? So Ezekiel is a reminder of how badly things can go for Jerusalem. However, the reasons that would come out are quite different. Okay, so in chapter 5, he talks about the signs. And again, something sort of strange. He was asked by God to shave off all his head and all his beard. Remember, Jewish men, hair was relatively long and a lot of beard, which would have been quite a sight to behold. A Jewish man then or now without any hair at all, completely bald. But then he had to do something very different with the hair. 1/3 of the hair, he must burn it. 1/3 of the hair, he must scatter it over the map. So it was happening right in that same scene. And then 1/3 of the hair, he was to scatter to the winds. Okay. And basically, he was told that this is what would happen to the people. 1/3 of them would die in the siege and the fall of Jerusalem. 1/3 of them would be scattered around the land. Well, most of them ended up running off to Egypt. And then another third would be scattered in the world, basically meaning the Babylonian world, like the wind. Now, the word wind is also the word for spirit. So there is a dual play here, that it is the spirit that is going to effect this scattering. When the Romans did this to the Jews, The modern world coined a term for it. We call it the diaspora. But the Babylonians were the first to commit a diaspora. But unlike the Roman diaspora, the Babylonians simply deported them all to its territories and gave them place to live there. The Romans just simply pushed them out of the land, scattered them all over the world. So the hair became a symbol of the fate of the people, that approximately a third of them would die in the war and the fall of Jerusalem. A third would be scattered within the land. That's why scattered over the map, and a third out of the land. A third of your people will die in the city from disease and famine. A third of them will be slaughtered by the enemy outside the city walls, so within the country, and I will scatter a third to the winds, chasing them with my sword. Now, if you go back and read more verses around verse 12, it is quite frightening that God sets himself up, not Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is depicted by Ezekiel as simply a tool in the hands of God. Nebuchadnezzar is the sword in God's hand. Nebuchadnezzar is the wind in God's hand. That God says, I am the one who will slaughter you. I am the one who will chase you to the four winds of the earth. And I will do that with my sword. He uses language that is very, very strong. Now, Jeremiah speaks about the fall of Jerusalem too, but his language is not quite as strong as Ezekiel. So picture the scene. He is there enacting the siege and fall of Jerusalem, and he does this strange thing with his hair and beard, and then he tells them that God is their enemy, not Babylon. When Habakkuk complained to God about the sins of Judah and basically challenges God on why he's doing nothing about it, God gave him an answer. He says, I'm sending my answer. And so Habakkuk is very concerned. What is your answer? God says, I am sending the Babylonians and they will clean up the nation. Habakkuk is so disturbed by that answer of God that he climbs up to the wall of the city and he tells God, I will stand up here on the wall until you give me the correct answer. He does not get the answer he wants, but eventually he comes to understand what God's will be like. And so the exiles already in Babylon with Ezekiel, probably watching this scene and listening to these words from God, would have shivered with fear. The thought in their minds is basically this: if God is now our enemy, does that mean this is the end? Not just the end of the nation, the disappearance of Israel, but the end of the covenant. Has God really given up on his people? And so when you look at Psalm 137, which depicts their mood in Babylon, somebody wrote this psalm: by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept. We hung up our harps on the poplar trees. And when asked, sing, sing, sing the Lord's song, they reply by, how can we sing the Lord's song in this foreign land, in this strange land? Now, interestingly, from a physical, economic point of view, their lives were not difficult. They were not slaves like in Egypt. They were not bound in chains and made to work. They were given one of the better areas of the Babylon territory to live on, the river Kebar, the Clong, the channel Kebar. But the spiritual awakening was not just depressing, it was a real mood killer. And then having to listen to this and realizing maybe for the first time in their history that God is so angry with them, he is ready to destroy them. That must have been a real spine tingler, to say the least. I don't know if you've ever watched any film where it's one of those really scary films, either a horror or an action film, and everything in you reacts like some people are reacting right now with the war in Gaza. And you're like, how can this be? This cannot be happening. And for them to realize this, it's not Nebuchadnezzar doing it to them. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was pretty kind to them. He was harsh to prisoners of war, but these were people that he wanted to enlist to serve him, to be in his government, even as we discover with Daniel and his friends. And so their physical and economic situation was not that bad, but the spiritual situation, the realization that God was the real enemy at this point, that must have been really, really awful for them. Now, we are also told the reasons for this judgment. Ezekiel, or God, gives Ezekiel very specific reasons for the judgment. The first one is the sin of Pesha. I don't know if you remember our series on the sanctuary. Pesha is the most serious kind of sin, but still kind of redeemable. It's not the worst sin. It is like third-degree sin. But there is no sacrifice available. All you can do is hope that God's grace will rescue you. And God lists their pesha. He says that you have, the word pesha means rebel, or to rebel against my regulations and my decrees. Basically, he is telling them that they have not followed any of the things, the instructions, the Torah, the regulations that he had given for their lives. That's why they were in this mess. Second is the depravity, moral depravity of the nation. Now we see this nearly 200 years before when we read Isaiah, that the depravity of the nation, morally speaking, was so deep that God said he will turn his face away from them. And here in Ezekiel, he uses this interesting language. You are more wicked than the surrounding nations. You're more wicked than the Babylonians. You're more wicked than the Canaanites that you were asked to remove from the face of the earth. You are more wicked than Sodom and Gomorrah. That would probably have come to their minds when they think about the nations around them. Okay? Definitely the Edomites and the Moabites, descendants of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Lot. The Amalekites, the Hittites, the Assyrians, who were known for their cruelty, and of course the Babylonians themselves. God says you're worse than all of them. Third reason, idolatry. There is a common thread that runs through all the prophets, starting from the 8th century, all the way down to the exile period, and even a little after the exile period. The number one sin of Israel in their history that led to this Babylonian captivity was idolatry. God uses the language that was used in in Isaiah nearly 200 years before. They're detestable idols. Isaiah's polemics against idolatry went something like this. You take a piece of wood, you carve it into an image, and then you bow down to it and worship it as if it is the one that has created you and brought you to life. And I'm the one who made you and made that piece of wood as well. How detestable is that? They're idols. Now, what happened to Israel when they came back from the Exodus? As they were settling the land, their number one fascination probably could be phrased like this. They wanted everything to be like everyone else around them. Eventually, that's how the monarchy was instituted, because we want to be like other nations. They were fascinated by the gods of the Canaanites or any other gods. They built what were called bemas, high places, to worship these other gods. Now, they did not turn their backs on God totally. They still went to the temple, they still brought their sacrifices, but they did both. They did the very thing that God asked them not to do. You shall have no other gods. You cannot make images of them, you cannot worship them, you cannot call them your gods. Because the moment you do that, you have mixed things between the true God, the Creator, versus any other gods. And so idolatry was stated as a reason for the exile as early as the prophecies of Hosea, Isaiah, Amos, Micah, and so on. And it's repeated here in the exile period by Ezekiel. So the sin of Pesha, this rebellion against God, moral depravity, and idolatry. This was the spiritual or the worship element. And then the fourth reason, holiness. God says, in doing all of these other things, you have defiled my temple. He's talking about that holy place, that place that was designated to be his physical home on earth on behalf of his people. When God asked Moses to build a tabernacle, there was a simple reason, that I may live among them. And that's Nebuchadnezzar understood this, and he knew that as long as that temple stood, the Jewish people would never be conquered. The Romans understood this too. As long as the temple stood, the Jewish people cannot be conquered. You know, the Romans and the Babylonians conquered people all over the world, especially the Romans, but they could not put down the Jewish rebellion until the destruction of the temple. It was an amazing piece of history. And Roman governors considered it a punishment, an exile, if they were asked to go to Palestine and to be the governor of Judea, or the procurator, as they were called. Nebuchadnezzar understood this too. He showed them that their God was lower than Marduk by taking all the furniture and the utensils that he could from the temple. By the way, he did not get the Ark of the Covenant, that disappeared around this time. Took them and placed them in Marduk's temple, the main god of the Babylonians. See, defiling God's place is a very serious thing. It can happen because of idolatry, when our lives worship something else, because of moral issues, when our lives are no better or sometimes worse than people who don't know God, and when we are in rebellion against his will, against his instructions. And so that's what happened to them. These were the reasons. But what was to be the nature of this judgment? God says, I am now your enemy. I will punish you publicly while all the nations watch. Nebuchadnezzar had to march these Jewish exiles all the way up the land to Syria, and then down through the land between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, in other words, the whole of Iraq, all the way to the southern part where the city of Babylon sat on the river Euphrates. It would have taken about 5 to 6 months for this march. And all the way they would be seen by every tribe, by every nation, every country along the way, all under Babylonian control now. But they would have seen the failure of this nation, the only monotheistic nation in that world. And in Nebuchadnezzar's world, the failure of a nation is the failure of that nation's God. But the Jewish people were to understand that God did not fail them. He had turned against them. He uses this language: I will cut you off completely. I will show you no pity at all. You know, some of the language of the Palestinians against Israel right now actually is a page of the book of Ezekiel. And this time it is Israel who apparently is not showing any pity at all. I will turn you into a ruin, a mockery in the eyes of the surrounding nations and to everyone who passes by. This great city would be burned to the ground and would lie fallow until a century later, when Ezra and then Zerubbabel and Nehemiah would come to rebuild the city. The city that David and Solomon had made one of the marvels of the ancient world would be left in ruins. But this prophecy is simply a repeat of prophecy of Isaiah far back as the 8th century, in the 5th chapter of his book, where he describes the nation of Judah being left desolate and in ruins, like a vineyard that is no longer being cared for. And then he describes the 3 things that would reappear again and again in the apocalypse: famine, disease, war. Famine, disease, war. If you want to have some fun and you're bored on Sabbath afternoon, read up the book of Revelation and see how many times these ideas, famine, disease, and war, would appear in those judgment scenes of Revelation. It's almost as if John is mimicking Ezekiel in talking about the judgments of God, whether you think of the seals, the trumpets, the 7 plagues, or the vineyard harvesting. All of them use these as the common elements. Jesus used them as common elements too for the end times: famine, disease, war. And every war in human history, these 3 things have been companions. So in a way, every war is a microcosm of God's displeasure with the world. Okay, but in this case, not the world, but his own people. It may be what led New Testament writers to assert that judgment, we read this in the Gospel of John, judgment always begins with the house of God. Judgment is not so much about the nations that don't worship God. God doesn't need to judge them too much. They're already against him. But his people, with their knowledge, with the revelation, with scripture, that's where the judgment will begin. All right, in chapter 6, he then describes this judgment a little more. He tells us that the main target of the judgment is the idolatry and apostasy that accompanied the nation of Judah, something they just could not get rid of from the time of Joshua till the time of the exile. And yet within 100 years in Babylon, they were cured of this disease, this virus that ate them up for almost 1,000 years prior to that. I'm about to bring war upon you, and I will smash your pagan shrines. God says, I will make sure that you don't have these idols to worship anymore. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't smash the shrines. No, that's not what happened physically. He smashed the temple. But spiritually, that's what would happen in the minds and the experience of the Jewish people. Your altars will be demolished. He's not talking about the temple alone. Your idols will be smashed. Your places of worship, these are those bema that I was telling you earlier, will be torn down, and all the religious objects you have made will be destroyed. They created these totem poles called Asherah poles and erected them everywhere so they could bow down and worship them. Most of us live here in Thailand, and you know that Thai people are really not religious at all. Well, kind of, slightly. But any Thai Buddhist walking down the street or through the village, and they see that little shrine that is there, like the Erawan shrine there in near the Siam Paragon, that area, they will somehow turn to it and do a why. There is a shrine at the entrance of my village, and most people who pass by, especially on foot, but I've seen some on bicycles and motorcycles will stop and why, and then they would move on. You see, that's what the Israelites were doing. These Asherah poles, we're not sure exactly what was carved on them, but they are similar to the totem poles of the Native Americans. And you hear the prophets constantly harp on this form of worship. So on Shabbat and during festivals, they were at the temple in Jerusalem. Every other day, they were at the feet of these totem poles or these bemas, offering their worship to any god and every god that they could find. We are also told about the consequences of this judgment, okay, in chapter 6. Again, war, famine, disease. Okay, that is a given. But this time we are told about the exile, and that they... Now, in terms of modern travel, Babylon to Jerusalem is not that far away, probably about an hour's flight, maybe an hour and a half. But for them, because they couldn't cross the desert in between, had to travel all the way up to Syria and then down the other way, it was a 5-6 months journey. Now, the Magi who visited Jesus at his birth and came from that part of the world, but probably further east, maybe Persia, It would have taken them months to get to Bethlehem to worship Jesus. So that the baby that they saw was not the newborn infant that the shepherds did, but a baby that was a few months old already. However, there's something new, and this would become an important part of biblical theology. That God says, despite what I'm going to do to you, I will let a few of you escape. They will be scattered among the nations, but a remnant will be saved. Now, as it turns out, the remnant was actually pretty large in number. In fact, the people who remained on the land were very few. Okay, so most of the so-called remnant would be the people outside of the land of Israel itself, outside of Jerusalem. Okay, so we need to understand, even though he uses the expression, I will let a few, my people, escape destruction, the numbers were actually pretty big. We know that the deported exiles were in the tens of thousands. Exactly how many, we are not sure. Those who ran away to Egypt were also in the tens of thousands. They took Jeremiah with them. So there was a prophet in Egypt and prophets in Babylon. Others who may have escaped to other parts of the world, we know that many of these Jews ran away to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Anatolia Plateau, and maybe further into Africa, like Ethiopia, eventually establishing Jewish communities over time in all of those areas. So the so-called remnant was not a tiny group, it was actually a lot. Now, compared to how many may have died in Jerusalem, they were the majority. You know, when I was a kid, they used to teach us that the remnant means that little bit that's left behind. And then I studied the Hebrew Bible and studied Hebrew properly and discovered that remnant means whatever is left behind. Once something is removed, whatever is left behind is the remnant. In this case, God kept the remnant in Babylon, some in Egypt, and others other places. What was removed were the ones who were killed by Nebuchadnezzar in the siege of Jerusalem. What was the purpose of this judgment? Two things. And this comes as unexpected to us and unnoticed by most Bible readers, but we see it in Isaiah, we see it in Hosea. The first purpose, God said, is for them to know, as in understand and acknowledge God's pain. They will remember me. They will recognize how hurt I am by their unfaithful hearts and lustful eyes. Every time they worshiped a totem pole, every time they brought an empty sacrifice, every time they rebelled against him, it caused pain to God. Hosea used the term of my heart is churned within me, my stomach is churned within me. Because of the covenant, no matter how much God is hurt, so to speak, he also does not give up. And so in Hosea 11, we read this cry from God, how can I give you up, O Israel? Hosea was pronouncing the coming exile. How can I let you go? I can never treat you like Sodom and Gomorrah. But they had to be punished. When a child is totally out of control, what do? Because a reason why some children get out of control is because they have no understanding of the pain that they cause their parents. The absence of that empathy with the parents' feelings is the main cause for children acting up. I don't care what my parents are feeling. It's just their business to take care of me. So I want what I want. So whether it's a young child kicking up a tantrum or a rebellious teenager or what other feelings. Now God is depicting himself here as a parent to the nation, which should hint to the fact that he will not completely give up on them. The second is to know God. For nearly 1,000 years in the land, they never got to know God. They never really took the time to know him. All of us here have parents. How many of us can honestly say that we really know our parents? We really understand how they think, why they do what they do, who they are. We're supposed to apply that knowledge to our relationship with God. Verse 10, they will know that I alone am the Lord. They will know that I am the Lord. 3 times in this chapter, he repeats this phrase. They will know that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh. When you go back to the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy, you discover that this is one of the most important instructions that Moses had given the people. That their job was not simply to make a living, have a career, occupy the land. Their job was to get to know their God. Shema Israel, hear Israel. The Lord our God is one Lord. That's what you are to know. Remember it, teach it to your children. Make signs of it on your arms, on your forehead, on your doors, and your gates. Talk about him when you're awake, when you're asleep, when you're in the house, when you're outside the house. They never accomplished that. In fact, by the time we reach Josiah, the good King Josiah, the Torah scrolls had been misplaced and nobody knew what it was and what it said. And when it was discovered in the repair of the temple and read to Josiah, he realized they had gone way, way off track and completely forgotten all the instructions of God. And that was the reaction of a good king, a godly king. So Ezekiel is telling them here that Babylon is the antivirus. The exile is the antidote against the poison of idolatry. The exile in Babylon is the place where they will finally come to know their God. The number one sin I said earlier was idolatry and apostasy. The people who came out of Babylon at the time of Cyrus never, ever went into that problem again. Yes, they would create new problems like legalism, but idolatry, the desire to worship other gods, they became students of the word, maybe almost to a fault. Okay, it was in Babylon that they would begin to establish the first so-called rabbinic school concept. It was in Babylon that they would start making copies of the scriptures. It was in Babylon that the first probable collection of all the various books that became Old Testament or Hebrew Bible began to take shape. You see, the purpose of God's judgment in the exile is not to beat them down, but rather to help them discover the paradigm shift that they should have discovered at the time of Joshua or David or Solomon or the great prophets of the 8th century, but they never did. They never did. Here in Babylon, everything that was wrong with them spiritually and morally was removed from the picture. Yes, they would create some new problems when they came back to the land, but never went back into idolatry. In fact, they became so how shall I say, so embedded into this concept of one God, the creator, our God, God of Israel, that it would define their history right up to our present day. I don't know how many of you have listened to the speeches of Netanyahu. By the way, the name Netanyahu is from 2 Hebrew words which mean gift of God, or gift of Yahweh. But he's actually quoting Hebrew Bible texts to validate his war in Gaza. I was so amused, especially by one of the texts from Deuteronomy 25. I was like, wow. And Netanyahu is not exactly known for being a religious man, but suddenly he finds scripture for his war in Gaza at the moment. So they would create these new problems, the sense of nationhood and nationality, the idea of religious extremism. By the time of Jesus, we have the Zealots and the Zacharis, who are the equivalent of Hezbollah and Hamas in our days. And all of that would happen, but never again were they tempted by idolatry. So the one thing that God decried them so much about prior to the exile was cured at the exile. No more COVID-19 for them after returning to the land. Other viruses would come, but not that one. Now, the last chapter in this collection is the dirge, the lamentation that Ezekiel wrote. It has it has 6 stanzas. You can see the listing there. The first 3 stanzas revolve around the expression, the end is here, the end has come, the day is here. Stanzas 4, 5, and 6 first talks about the devastation of war. Secondly, the 5th stanza talks about the futility of wealth, because in war, no matter how rich you are, you could still end up dead. Okay, and in the case of the Babylonians, burning up the city means that all your wealth is gone, so wealth will not help you. And most importantly, in this dirge, why the lamentation of Ezekiel is that the leaders of Israel by this stage were completely helpless to do anything about it. The king himself, the last king of Judah, Zedekiah, would end up an exile, basically a house prisoner, or so, to the Babylonians. They could not save the nations. God had told Josiah at the time of his Reformation that he will hold his hand until after Josiah had died, but nothing can hold back the coming judgment of God. So they've known this for a fair period of time, for at least 50 years from the time of Josiah until Ezekiel reminded them. And it, again, like chapter 6, 3 times in chapter 7, in this lamentation, comes this phrase, they will know that I am Yahweh. Now, I think what these chapters illustrate is a simple case in point. You cannot push God too far, but if God goes against his people, he has one singular intention behind it, so that we will wake up and know that he is God. Judgment is never for the sake of punishment. It's for the sake of redemption, for the sake of correction, the sake of transformation. Because sometimes without that judgment, there is no paradigm shift. When you look at the history of the people of Israel, from Joshua until Zedekiah, that paradigm shift they could not make. No matter how many good kings they had, no matter how many prophets God sent to them. But less than a century in Babylon, it was cured. And so something to think about. That maybe this sort of explains what Solomon had written in the Proverbs, that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. I don't think that he is talking about child abuse. He is talking about how indulgence, God indulged in his love for the people. He kept dragging the punishment, and they got worse and worse through time. Indulgence does not make better children. Some discipline, some correction, sometimes correction that really bites, wakes them up and helps them to realize, wait, I need to get things in proper order. And that is what was being predicted. Now, what you can see in these chapters are seeds of the later part of the books, where the scene would shift more away from judgment towards restoration and comfort and so on and so forth. And so he's planting some of those seeds that they did not take the time to know Yahweh on their own. So God is going to put them in a place where they would be compelled to do that, where they would actually do that. So the lamentation may not be a pure lamentation the way we would think. We need to see the dirge as sprinkled with some powder of hope, so to speak, so that you will know that I am Yahweh, so that you will know I am the Lord your God. I am not going to break that relationship, but you have to wake up to it. And that is what we see in these chapters. Next week, we'll look at another block of chapters, still dealing with Judah, before we get to where he's dealing with the other nations and so on. That will be more or less the sequence that we will be following. And so this is not a happy segment of the book. It's in fact a little bit depressing. And studying it just before Sabbath, a day of celebration, is kind of ironic. But maybe it is beneficial to realize that God indulges his people, but only to a point. And perhaps this is why the New Testament is very strong on the fact that you must never test God. You do not push God. You treat God as your Father. So when the disciples asked Jesus, how should we pray? He didn't say, dear God, or God Most High, or Baruch Atah Adonai, none of those things. He says, say, our Father. That's what the exile was intended to do. And it did accomplish that to some extent. Not completely, but it did accomplish that to some extent. At least idolatry and apostasy were removed from their vocabulary, were removed from their worldview, were removed from their hearts and their lives. And so, in that sense, what Ezekiel did here, what he showed, what he enacted, they carried those seeds of hope going forward through the book and through the exile period itself. All right, let me close the recording.